Hello everyone, welcome to another video on Piston Door Terminologies. Today I'll be talking about expandable and tileable, and this is recorded as of 22nd February 2025. So we start off by explaining the definition of expandable, and this is taken from the Door Rules document section 2.1 DV. So it says that expandable doors should have sets of additional layers that can be repeated to expand the frame simultaneously with each other, while the original wiring only needs minor changes. So there are some keywords that you have to notice here. So the first word is the one in bold, simultaneous, and then the second is actually a bit more strange. The phrase you need to notice is minor changes. I'll talk a bit more about that later. And it also has another condition, is that all layers are controlled from one input located on the original wiring. So the phrase one input is also important here. Now, expandable actually has two tiers. The first tier, we call it infinitely expandable. And as the name suggests, it means that the door can be expanded indefinitely. And you might already guess the second tier, which is finitely expandable. Now, there's actually a limit at minimum, which is 8. But then it basically means there is a limit at maximum that is finite to how much the door can be expanded. But then, yeah, we also impose a minimum limit on how much the door can be expanded. So yeah, so that is a thing to notice. Now, in contrast to expandable, we have tileable. And this actually depends on the definition of expandable. This is located in section 2.1 DVI. Now, the first sentence says, as expandable, but the sets of repeated layers, or in this scenario, we call them tiles. And these sets of repeated layers are independent of each other. So if you recall the definition of expandable, it's simultaneous, but then tileable is independent. Okay. Now, the second condition is that all layers have their own input, which controls only its respective layer. So the thing to notice is have their own input, and in contrast to expandable, there's only one input that controls all layers. So later, I'll also emphasize on the differences between expandable and tileable. Now, for tileable, there's also two tiers actually, although people often overlook. Now, the first tier is full tileable. It states that each tile does not affect adjacent tiles. Now, in contrast, is semi-tileable. But then what does it actually mean? Well, each tile affects adjacent tiles if their operations occur at the same time. And yeah, so you see the difference between full tileable and semi-tileable. Although the phrase occur at the same time can have some interpretation issues between people basically, and I'll explain how you should interpret it correctly. So yeah, now before I jump into the examples illustrated in the Minecraft world, so let me just give you some questions to think of, and I'll also provide the answers. So the main question is, what is the difference between expandable and tileable? Now, for expandable, there is a condition that states that we have one input that controls all layers. But then for tileable, it is multiple inputs, and each input corresponds to its own unique layer and controls it. So you see the difference. Expandable only has one input, tileable has multiple inputs, and expandable controls all the layers, but then tileable only controls itself, not the other ones. So you see the difference already, hopefully. Now, the other thing I want to ask is, in expandable, I said before, a phrase called minor changes, but then what does it mean exactly? Because for definitions, we do want to, sometimes know some phrases rigorously. And unfortunately here, there's actually no official definition. Instead, it's actually best illustrated by example, which I'll, show in the Minecraft illustrations. Now, I also want to add my own personal opinion is that it's actually not quite a meaningful question here. The more meaningful stuff to do is to demonstrate how to expand your door, rather than just stating how minor the changes are. So as long as you can demonstrate how the door can be expanded, it should be sufficient already. So we don't have to worry too much about the phrase minor changes. Okay. Now, the third question is, in semi-tileable, what exactly does operations occur at the same time mean? Because to some people, they might think that, well, operations occur at the same time means the tiles are activated in sync, but this is actually not the case. It means that the operation time of a tile partially or fully coincides with the operation time of an adjacent tile. So you see the phrase partially or fully coincides instead of only fully coincides. Now let's just show what I mean. So partially coincides, you can see by these rectangular bars, which basically show the operation times of two adjacent tiles, for example, where one tile is activated a bit earlier than the other tile, but then they have some overlap in the operation times, versus the fully coincides version, where basically two tiles are activated at the same time. So both of these scenarios satisfy the condition operations occur at the same time. It's not only the fully coincides version, but also the partially coincides version. So that's the thing that you need to notice. So that is the correct interpretation on the operations occur at the same time phrase. So yeah. And now I'll hop on to the Minecraft world to illustrate you some examples on expandable and tileable and its own respective tiers. So yeah, let's head on to that. Okay, so we have logged into the Minecraft world. Now, here I will show you 4 examples, and I will give you, the visuals of how the extenders work, and then to illustrate how are expandable and tileable different, basically. So this kind of extender is a pushing extender. I use a pushing downwards double extender, so you can basically see what it does. It basically extends, but then also retracts the blocks. So yeah. And for the first design, we have this kind of thing. Now, the question we need to ask first is this design expandable or tileable? Well, according to the definition, we see expandable has one input that controls all layers, but tileable is multiple inputs controlling its own respective layer. So how many inputs do we see? We see 1, right? So this must be an expandable build because it is one input that controls all layers. All right. We know that it's expandable, but then is it infinitely expandable or finitely expandable? Well, we all know that redstone dust has a maximum signal strength of 15. And that is a finite limit. So you can place redstone dust, to the left and to the right, and adding the middle layer, you would get a maximum of 31 layers in total. So this would be finitely expandable because we are relying on redstone dust to expand. And 31 would be the maximum. Of course, you can do some other stuff to make it even longer, but then let's just assume that we are just going to copy this entire layer over and over. So that in this case, the maximum would be 31, which is finite, of course. So this is finitely expandable design. And then next, let me move on to this kind of design. So, it works also something like that. Although the animation is a bit different, but then it still does the same thing. Okay, so again, the first question we need to ask is if this is expandable or tileable. Now, it's very similar to this here. It is also one input controlling all layers. And according to the definition, of course, this is going to be expandable instead of tileable. Tileable needs multiple inputs controlling its own respective layer, but then expandable only needs one input that controls all layers. So this is an expandable design. Next, we ask ourselves if this is infinitely expandable or finitely expandable. Now, the expandability of this extender relies on basically just stacking observers over and over. While this adds delay, this actually does not even have any limit, theoretically. You can basically just expand this indefinitely. So, according to the definition, this would be infinitely expandable. I can just expand it across, as long as the chunks are loaded, basically. And in theoretical terms, it is definitely going to be infinite. So this is infinitely expandable. So yeah. And then next, we'll move on to this here. So this works something like this, and you can see this tile. When I activate this input, it does not affect this. So is this expandable or tileable? Well, I already used the word tile, so you probably have a gist of it. We can see that each layer has its own input that controls itself. So having multiple inputs and each input controls itself, this suggests that this is tileable, right? But then now we ask ourselves if this is full tileable or semi-tileable. Now, to answer this question, we can actually set up some circuit like this. Now, recall that we say that semi-tileable is tiles can affect each other when their operations occur at the same time, and that includes both partially or fully coincides. So, of course, we can test the fully coincide version by having these two repeaters at the same delay. But then, they both work, basically. Then we can test it with, different delays. So this would be the partially coincides version. Now, while some delay like this does seem to work, it actually would fail if I do something like this. You see that this block is, left out here, which is not what we want the extender to do. So this design is semi-tileable because in this delay setting, we actually have the tiles affect each other. So yeah, this is a semi-tileable design. And then finally, we move on to this example. It is, the working principle is very similar to that one there. And we can see there are multiple inputs. So now we ask ourselves if this is expandable or tileable. Well, we see multiple layers. We see multiple inputs, and each input controls itself. So, according to the definition, this is tileable. Now, is it semi-tileable or full tileable? Well, to answer this question, we basically need to know the working principle of this extender. We have this observer that will update this piston when it's getting QC'd by this observer through the solid block. Now you might ask whether this piston would update the other pistons at incorrect times, and the answer is no, because it must be at the time where the block is QCing this piston, basically, which of course the observer here will do its job to update it. So there's no dependencies or no effects from the other tiles, basically. So this is in fact full tileable. So adjacent tiles, no matter how they update, they won't affect the adjacent tiles. So so this is full tileable. And so in these 4 examples, we have covered all possible scenarios, basically. The finitely expandable, infinitely expandable, semi-tileable, and full tileable. So so these are all the examples that I'll show. And one more thing is that on the expandable designs, I talked about, the phrase minor changes. And I said that, it doesn't really matter what minor changes means. It's just important for you to demonstrate how to expand it, but then we can also kind of see what minor changes really mean. So for example, we have this expandable design where we have, a dropper here, but then the adjacent layer, we replace the dropper with a redstone dust. So this would be, a minor change, you can say. And similar to here, we have an observer facing downwards, but then on this layer, we have an observer facing sideways. So, this is also kind of a minor change. But then, no matter how minor the changes or how major the changes, as long as you can demonstrate that is expandable, then, you're good, basically. So, so that's that. And now we'll get back into the presentation slides. Okay, so one of the reasons I want to make this video is to point out some common mistakes, because people often confuse between expandable and tileable, and hopefully my examples do illustrate and resolve some of the issues quite a bit. But then also let me just state something. So of course the first mistake is the confusion between expandable and tileable. This is basically the intent of why I'm making this video now. And in many cases, people use tileable when they in fact mean expandable. So it's always people saying they want a tileable thing, but what they actually mean is they want an expandable thing. The other way around is very rare and less occurring, basically. Now, this occurs very frequently in redstone requests, especially someone, like me, who does a lot of them. So, for example, people might ask for some one-wide tileable designs. But then we might already see some problems with tileable. Is that, first off, tileable is actually often harder to make, because you have to make sure that the tiles at least don't affect each other when they don't operate at the same time. That's the minimum thing you need to do. And it's also actually less practical than expandable, at least in the piston door world. Because why would you want a piston door that works separately in its own layers when, it is just not reasonable? You want one input to control all the layers instead of having multiple inputs to control multiple things. And I'm not sure why it would be a case for you to use a tileable piston door, basically. So so hopefully this makes sense. It's basically just less practical than expandable. Of course, I'm very sure that tileable is a useful restriction in places other than piston doors, but then in piston doors, you don't really need tileable that much, at least. So in computational, tileable might be a more useful restriction, but then in piston doors, not so much. So now the other common mistake is the misinterpretation of semi-tileable versus full tileable. The keyword that people often misinterpret is effects. So what does effect mean? People often interpret effect means breaking. So this is also reflected in the Minecraft world example, because, when I activate the tiles in a one tick or 2 game tick delay setting, you see one of the tile break. But then this is just one case of effect. So what I mean is that breaking due to operating at the same time is a sufficient but not necessary condition. So if you can demonstrate that 2 tiles occur operating at the same time causes one of the tiles to break, then this is a sufficient condition to say that, oh, this design is semi-tileable. But then it's not a necessary condition. Now, the reason behind this is because effect has multiple examples that, satisfy the definition of effect. This includes speeding up, slowing down, or, basically just derping adjacent tiles, because why not? All these scenarios can satisfy the word effect. So we interpret the word effect literally. So not only braking, but also, speeding up, slowing down, making the speeds different, or, making the adjacent tiles work a bit more funky. So all of these are examples of effect. And all of these examples are, of course, sufficient but not necessary conditions. So yeah. But then as long as you can show one of the examples, then you can say confidently that it is semi-tileable instead of full tileable. So as long as you can show one of the examples of effect. So yeah. So that's the thing that you have to remember when you're considering the differences between semi-tileable and full tileable. So yeah. Now, I'll also cover a bit more on the expandable volume since we're here. So there are actually 3 regulations that try to illustrate how volume is calculated for expandable designs. And they are section 4.2 E, F, G, basically. And obviously, I don't necessarily expect you to know very deeply about volume, but then just have an introductory level of understanding is already sufficient. So, So in this regulation, it says the overall volume of an expandable build consists of 2 parts. The first part would be the control wiring volume. It states that this is basically a static part of the overall volume, and expanding the build does not increase its volume. And you might already guess the second part is the expandable layer volume, which is the dynamic part of the overall volume, and expanding the build will increase its volume. So, in other words, the control wiring volume is just basically the part of the wiring that is basically a constant. It won't change the volume no matter how many layers you have. But then the expandable layer volume obviously is the layers that you're trying to expand, and this will increase the volume, of course. So yeah. And then we go on to section 4.2F. So now this is the construction on how you would describe an expandable record, or specifically the expandable volume. It consists of 4 parts. The first part would be the title. So basically all the record titles that you have, smallest, fastest, and then your wiring restrictions, and then, your door type, all of those would be there. So title, basically. And then we will explain the volume as an expression of basically a linear equation. I'll show that later. And we also need to tell people the domain, expandable domain of layers. So from where to where, because 2 different expandable doors can have different domains. Maybe, for example, one works from 8 to 16, the other one works from 10 to 50. So we need to state this clearly. We also need to tell people which part of the domain, as a subset of the expandable domain of layers, is record breaking. Because while an expandable door can have a large domain, we still need it to be record breaking for a certain part of the domain. So we need to state that as well. So here just shows you an example from the regulations directly. We have a smallest expandable free high XY staircase door. In reality, we would usually omit the term XY, but then I just left this here. So the volume, as I said, should be expressed as a linear equation. So we have 40 plus 20x blocks. So you will see 40 is the static part and 20x is the dynamic part. And then we also need to state to others the expandable domain of layers. So at the right, it says x equals 1 to 14. So, you can expand this door and have layers from 1 to 14 and it will work. Okay, and then we also need to tell people which domain of layers it is actually record breaking. So it breaks records at x equals 5 to 14. So yeah, so this means that if you have, 5 layers, then this door would be obtaining its respective title. Usually it will be the smallest title, but then, you also have other cases, but then usually smallest. This also tells you something a bit more, is that from 1 to 4, it does not break the record. So you see the reason why we need to tell people the record-breaking domain of layers. Because we need to illustrate, hey, it is at least record-breaking at some part of the domain. So yeah, so that's important. And this is also one of the regulations, basically, is that as long as you have a certain non-empty domain that is record breaking, then the expandable door can be considered as smallest. So yeah. And then finally, we have section 4.2g. This basically just tells you the thing that I just said. A door is considered smallest if there is at least one layer which is smaller than other doors in the same record category. So notice the term at least one layer. So this also means that, the same category of expandable doors can have multiple doors that holds the record, but they of course have to hold the record at different domains. So yeah. Now let's give you one example. Let's say there are 2 doors, and of course 2 doors would correspond to 2 volumes basically. And of course, the 2 doors are in the same category. So one door has the volume 40 plus 20x blocks, and then the other door has 60 plus 10x blocks. Then we can of course see that 40 plus 20x will be smaller than 60 plus 10x when x is less than or equal to 2, and vice versa. 60 plus 10x would be smallest for x larger than or equal to 2. So yeah, so basically that's that. And here I just want to add a note is that, of course, in reality, we cannot have both of these records be smallest at x equal 2. This would depend on which record comes in first. So, yeah, so this is already stated in section 4.2, the smallest title, how we can achieve the smallest. So yeah. And with that, thank you for watching this video. I hope this clears out any confusion or common mistakes that people often make in Expandable and Tileable, and hopefully you also learn a bit more on these piston door terminologies, and I'll see you in the next one.